Hi, it's Mike from Studio Wizards. I have one short video about the master fader in your DAW, because this is a question that many people seem to have a lot of problem with, is what level should the master fader in the DAW or sequencer be at? And the short answer to that question is at zero, at unity. It should always be at zero gain and just left there, and that's it for every project. And basically there's not a lot of use in having that fader in the first place. There is really nothing you should be doing with that fader in the mix. It's just set it at zero and leave it there. And then the next question people have is, well, if I set it at zero, then how do I control my monitoring? How do I control the volume that's coming out of the speakers? Well, the whole point is that you should have a separate control for the volume of your speakers. However you do that will depend on your setup, but it's not the DAW master fader. That's not what's used to control the volume of your speakers. If you've got a sound card and it has a mixer application inside it to control the output level, for example, to the line outputs, that's what you should be using to control your speakers, because that's not affecting the audio in the sequencer. If you've got a hardware mixer, you can use the monitoring section on that. You can send the output of your sound card, if you don't have any control in the sound card, which is useful, you can send it to a little analog mixer or a hardware mixer or a digital mixer, whatever it is, and use that to control the monitoring. So this is the monitoring level of my audio from the audio interfaces to the monitors. This is the master fader in the DAW. So if I want to control the volume, I use the control from the RME interface. It's very important, though, at the same time, to have some kind of immediate access to your monitoring control, like a hardware, like an actual mixer control knob or fader in the real world, because sometimes if you're monitoring, you're going to have to be able to control the levels. Sometimes it's going to be too low compared to the mix. You're not always playing back mastered material. So if you're playing back something from Spotify, it's mastered, it's loud, and then you go to play something back from your DAW, it might be 20, 30 dB too low. So you're going to need some control where you can actually bring that up, but that's not the master fader. That's going to be the control in your sound card, audio interface, whatever it is, or a hardware mixer, or some attenuator, like one of those passive attenuator volume controls between your sound card and your monitoring system, because most of the monitoring systems we have these days are active, so you don't actually have a volume control. In the old days, I mean, you had an analog amplifier on the desk, maybe, which had volume control, but even then you would still use the volume control in a mixing console in the monitoring section to control the monitors. This is relevant because if you use the volume control in the master fader in a DAW, if you turn this down, what you're doing is you're losing dynamic range. Basically, it's if you print the track with the master fader minus 20 dBFS, you've killed 20 dB of your track. Your track is going to be 20 dB lower than it should be. If you print it with a master fader value of plus something, like +1, you have a good chance of clipping the the bounced recording. So there's no reason to change it. There's no reason to actually use it. The only one application for the master fader in a DAW is to fade out at the end of a track, if that's in mastering, if that would be the chosen move. But in mixing, basically there is no reason to use the master fader in the DAW. So there has to be some other way of doing it. Whatever, it depends on your setup. You might have to get a hardware monitor controller. You might have to get a if your audio interface has, for example, a MIDI capability like the RME, then you might get a MIDI controller and use that to control the monitoring output of the sound card. If maybe you can use a tablet computer, if it's got OSC, to control, again, the mixer application of the audio interface, such as the Motu has this and RME has this. Or you're going to use like a hardware mixer, maybe just a little analog mixer for a couple €100 just to use that, just to use it as an attenuator. So you have like an actual volume control for the monitoring. Or there are plenty of these little passive boxes. Just it's an analog potentiometer in a box as a monitor controller, and all it's doing is turning the level down between your audio interface and your monitors. But something like this is basically a necessity, and especially if you get into having like louder monitoring systems, then it gets very important to have a hardware control where you can like turn it down, because it's not always very pleasant if you get something playing at full scale dBFS, even noise, or even you get the worst case, you get a feedback loop. Something like this will destroy your monitoring system unless you can switch it off quickly enough. And having a hardware control over it is one way of being able to switch it off if you need to. The other thing I have is I have basically the power to my monitoring. I have the power extension is just under the desk within arm's reach, so that if anything goes completely wrong and the computer is frozen and the audio interface is frozen, normally I'm controlling it using that, I can just kill the power to all the speakers with one button on the desk or underneath the desk, which it's quite useful to have because I have a very large monitoring system. So it means that if something goes wrong, it goes wrong really badly. And it has saved my tweeters on one occasion. You get a software glitch and something crashes, and it can be quite painful, because you've got quite a lot of gain in the monitoring system. You're working on material which is not mastered, so you are actually adding quite a lot of gain to be able to hear what you're doing. And then if something does go wrong and you get a full scale signal, then it can be very nasty. So that's after you get like an audio interface and speakers with monitoring. The next thing is you really need some kind of control for that. And if you're lucky enough, it can be the mixer application from the audio interface that you already have. It might have a very good way of controlling the volume, just the levels going to the line outputs, which are your monitoring levels. So I'm using the RME, that's very good for that. I used the MIDI controllers with it, that was fantastic. I used then their remote control, which is also fantastic. Motu, I have an interface, they have a mixer application and you can control it through MIDI and through OSC, which is a different protocol. So it's absolutely super important to have some kind of hardware control over it. And that's, once you have that, then you don't need to use the DAW master fader, which is the wrong thing to control the monitoring system. Okay, that's it. Okay, that's the short explanation of the master fader in the DAW and what you should basically not be doing with it. If you've got any questions or comments, then just let me know. You can contact me directly and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Thanks.